To understand why the Cold War escalated, you have to start with the Bay of Pigs invasion. I know that most of you have looked at this already, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail about this event. So, this happened in 1961, and it was basically an unsuccessful attempt at invasion following the Cuban Revolution that brought this man right here, Fidel Castro, to power. So, in Cuba, there was a revolution and uprising that was led by Fidel Castro, and they ended up overturning the current government and getting into power. And this was not helpful to the US because Castro was pro-communism. And the US did not want a communist leader so close to them. So this whole attempt at invading and re-overturning Castro was planned and funded by the United States. However, it was not going to be carried out by US soldiers. It was going to be carried out by armed Cuban exiles in southwest Cuba, those who did not want Castro to be in power. So the US joined forces with these exiles to then invade Cuba. However, this was ultimately going to be unsuccessful. Castro was going to have military intelligence that told him when and where it was going to happen. So when the invasion actually happened, the people were waiting there, and it was basically a massacre of the exiles and of the CIA American operatives who were there for the mission. Not only that, but this action accelerated a rapid deterioration in Cuban-American relations. And this is going to be worsened by the Cuban Missile Crisis later that year, but we'll get to that in a second. It is just now getting to be to the point where the US and Cuba are starting to interact again. President Obama has had a great hand in reopening these communications. So the crisis. It happened in October of 1962. This is when the US and the Soviet Union basically had a 13-day standoff to see if someone was going to fire first. So because of the US kind of invading Cuba, the Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to ally themselves in Cuba. So they installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which happens to be less than 100 miles from the United States. This was a really big deal because this was the first movement to bring the Cold War to the Western Hemisphere, where the US is. Everything else used to be over in the Eastern Hemisphere. And because these missiles would easily allow the Soviets to attack US soil if they really wanted to. So the US decided to show force to the Soviet Union. So Kennedy prepared a naval blockade, which is actually an act of war, but they called it a quarantine. Basically, they used US naval ships to surround Cuba, at least on the US side. This was a way to show power, but also to be in place if the fighting did start. Because President Kennedy wanted to make it clear that the US was prepared to use military action if necessary to stop the threat to US security. After days of tension and people really thinking that World War III was about to happen, the Soviet ships turned around. As you can see on this map, this is Cuba right here. And the Soviets came in and they built these missiles all along Cuba. And right up here, only 100 miles away, is the US. So that is really close. So basically, they decided to fix this situation with diplomacy, which means they were going to talk it out instead of using their weapons. So the Soviet Union agreed not to install weapons in Cuba, not to put the missiles there, but the US had to remove all their nuclear weapons from Turkey, which is really close to the Soviet Union, and they had to promise not to invade Cuba. So everyone was pretty much relieved that this was solved without fighting, because the entire world was worried that it would start to World War III. Another really important part of the Cold War is the Berlin Wall. So you all noticed on your maps that Germany was cut into two pieces, the West and the East. So the West is going to be the democratic side, which includes France, Great Britain, and the US. And the eastern side is going to be communist, which is run by the Soviet Union. And basically overnight, the Soviet Union is going to put up a wall around West Berlin. This is going to not only create a physical separation, but it's going to create an emotional, a psychological separation as well. So it's going to happen in August of 1961. So East Germany built this wall that separated East and West Berlin. And this is going to be called the Berlin Wall. And it's going to actually divide the city for over 28 years. It's the same country. It's all Germany. But these are controlled by two different types of countries and two different types of economic situations. The red being the Soviet Union with communism, and the blue over here in the West is going to be democratic. So basically it's East against West. The political differences divide the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe and Western Europe. These differences are going to cause what is called an Iron Curtain. Now this is not an actual curtain, so don't get confused with the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was an actual wall that went up. The Iron Curtain is a metaphorical curtain, meaning not real, that split Europe into two different parts with their ideas. So this is another example of communism versus democracy. The Iron Curtain is just kind of something you can think of in your head that separates communism and democracy. So people living in the eastern part, which is controlled by the communist part, the Soviet Union part, they were not allowed to travel outside their country, and Westerners who wanted to visit the eastern part either were not allowed or faced restriction. As I said before, this curtain, the Iron Curtain, is not an actual curtain. So this is the wall right here, but the Iron Curtain is this idea of a curtain. And I know it's in red here, but that's because it's trying to explain where the shift in thinking was. So the physical wall is only between West and East Germany, right up here. But the Iron Curtain is separating those political ideologies. Democracy in the West, communism in the East. It was a political barrier that's going to isolate Eastern Europe from Western Europe. This side, the East side, is going to go basically in the dark, metaphorically, meaning that they're not going to have access to the sorts of treatment as well as resources that the West is going to have. So the rest of Europe, the daily lives of citizens of the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries was going to be very difficult. Many people had little, if anything, in their governments. Soviet leaders are going to try to create a strong national identity. For example, in Latvia, which is when the communists took over there, people started to think of themselves as Soviets instead of Latvians. So the Soviet Union wanted total control of daily life. So they outlawed a lot of celebrations. They destroyed churches and religious buildings. They also killed religious leaders. And other ethnic group members were not allowed to speak their native languages. Everyone had to speak the native language of the Soviet Union. And the government is going to control the communications media, meaning newspapers, books, and radios. They're also going to control literature and the arts. So writers, poets, other artists are banned and censored. Artists are forced to join government-run unions, and the unions told the artists what to create. And if an artist refused or disobeyed, they were jailed or killed.